Jean-Claude Van Damme, the immortal muscles from Brussels, is the man who once made the world hold its breath. From Frank Dux in Bloodsport to Kurt Sloane in Kickboxer and the legendary twins in Double Impact, he wasn't just an action star. He was a phenomenon.
She was
a furious storm of power and grace, a living monument of Hollywood's golden age of martial arts cinema. His splits defied the limits of the human body. His fiery kicks and his piercing gaze burned into the memory of millions in the 80s and 90s, turning his very name into an eternal icon. But behind the lights and the thunderous applause lay wounds that never healed, 5 broken marriages, betrayals that shattered his trust, an abyss of addiction that nearly killed him, scandals that dragged his pride into the mud, and a darkness that still stalks his nights.
Okay, she's leaving the scene.
Now,
it's okay.
at 63,
so I cannot go without
Van
her.
Damme no longer fights for
She
glory.
cannot go without
He
me.
battles a chapter harsher
don't even think
than
about the
any
future.
role he
I
ever
wish
played.
we can go together.
A warrior carrying scars that never close.
She has a way.
Haunted by pains no spotlight can ever hide. And yet, behind those eyes are secrets never revealed. What wounds still burn in silence? The answers are tragic, haunting, unforgettable. If you still admire the legend who conquered the world, hit like now. This is a tribute to a fighter whose greatest battles were not on screen, but in life itself. Behind the man who could shatter mountains with a single kick lived a fragile spirit, waging silent wars against weakness, fear, and the cruel echo of laughter that left scars no one could see. Jean-Claude Camille Francois Van Varenberg, later immortalized as Jean-Claude Van Damme, was born on October 18, 1960, in Berchem-Saint-Agathe, a quiet corner near Brussels. His father, Eugène, an accountant, kept order with numbers. His mother, Eliana, a florist, filled their modest home with color. His sister, Veronique, was his Veronique was his only companion. On the surface, life looked ordinary, but in the mirror he saw a heartbreaking image. A skinny boy with thick glasses, mocked as a puny Four Eyes. A dreamer trapped inside a body too frail to carry his dreams. At 11, he would later recall, he stood staring at his reflection and felt the sting of humiliation, vowing to rewrite the ending of his own story. His first battles were not fought in a ring, but inside his heart, against ridicule, against doubt, against the crushing silence that felt heavier than words. His father, sensing the storm within, enrolled him at the Centre National de Karaté in Excel, under Master Claude Guts. For 4 brutal years, Jean-Claude drilled until discipline became his second skin. At 18, he earned a black belt in Shotokan Karate and joined Belgium's national team, finally learning how to turn shame into strength and fear into focus. But strength alone was not enough. Defying mockery, he chose ballet. 5 relentless years at the bar forged balance, grace, and endurance beyond imagination. Ballet is the hardest, he would say years later. If you can survive a ballet workout, you can survive anything. To complete the transformation, he turned to bodybuilding, reshaping the fragile boy into a figure of steel. In 1978, the world noticed when he claimed the title of Mr. Belgium. Yet the trophies meant little compared to what he had won inside: belief. Around the age of 12, one restless night, he walked alone into a church and whispered 3 impossible wishes: to save the world, to protect nature, and to become a movie star. Naive, perhaps, but to a lonely boy desperate for light, they were lifelines. These early battles, heartbreaking, cruel, yet strangely beautiful, etched themselves into his soul, preparing him for a destiny larger than he could imagine. From a small Belgian parish to the unforgiving mirrors of a dance studio, from bruised pride to black belt discipline, Jean-Claude Van Damme was already rehearsing for the greatest fight of his life. Not against an enemy on screen, but against the darkness within and the world's brutal certainty that he would never be enough. He left Belgium with muscles forged in karate, ballet, and bodybuilding. But all that strength could not shield him from what awaited in America. Jean-Claude Van Damme, carrying only 3 a broken accent, and a dream bigger than his own body, landed in the United States in 1982 with his friend Michel Kesey. Hollywood was a galaxy away, and he was just another anonymous immigrant staring at a city that didn't care if he lived or died. Nights found him curled inside the back seat of a beat-up car, the upholstery torn, the windows fogged with his own breath, his stomach twisting so violently with hunger that sleep became impossible. He confessed later that he sometimes stole food, an apple here, a sandwich there, not from defiance but from desperation, the kind of desperation that gnaws at your bones until you feel hollow inside. Days blurred into weeks of pounding the pavement, knocking on studio doors, only to have them slam shut again and again. Some said it was more than 100 auditions, each ending the same way: a polite smile, a shake of the head, or worse, laughter at the way his tongue stumbled over English words. Every rejection felt like a knife, and the silence of the telephone afterward wasn't just quiet. It was a sentence, a verdict that perhaps he would never belong. And yet, every morning, even with an empty stomach, he forced himself to stretch, to train, to split, until the pain screamed through his legs. All the time, I believed in my head that my dream would happen. Every day I said, "Thank you in advance for my success." He later confessed it was madness to believe, but belief was all he had. In Belgium, he had been mocked as a puny Four Eyes. In America, he was dismissed as just another foreigner. Between those humiliations, he found one constant: the discipline of his body, the only language he could still speak fluently. To survive, he worked anywhere that would take him, delivering pizzas, laying parquet floors, driving limousines, even standing as a bouncer in Chuck Norris's bar, Woody's Wharf. The irony cut deep, protecting strangers at night while dreaming of fighting villains on the silver screen. Still, he kept showing up, kept offering his fists and his smile, certain that one day someone would notice. In 1984, he flickered briefly across the screen in Breakin', a background dancer whose splits went unnoticed by most. That same year, he joined Chuck Norris's stunt team in Missing in Action, a job that paid almost nothing, but proved he could bleed for the camera. The break never came easily. Only in 1986 did he finally catch a role with a face and a name, playing the Russian villain Ivan in No Retreat, No Surrender. It was a small film, cheaply made, but it was a victory that tasted like sunlight after years of rain. He was no longer a hungry boy in the back of a car. He was on screen. These years were not glamorous. They were brutal. Poverty, humiliation, the crushing loneliness of exile. Those were his sparring partners. But from the depths of that struggle emerged the grit that would later make him the Muscles from Brussels. Every rejection was a wound, every night in that car, a scar. And yet, each one stitched into the fabric of a legend in the making. He had once curled up in the back seat of a broken car, shivering through nights with nothing but hunger for company, stealing scraps of food to quiet the storm in his stomach, walking out of casting rooms after being mocked for his accent. Over 100 humiliating rejections told him he would never belong. And yet, in 1988, the world finally looked his way. The boy who had once knelt trembling in a Belgian church, whispering 3 impossible wishes, now saw one erupt into reality. Bloodsport hit the screen, and with it, Jean-Claude Van Damme erupted into legend. On screen, he was Frank Dux, fighting in a hidden tournament, but in truth, he was fighting for every cold night, every slammed door, every insult that said he was invisible. Made for just $1 million, the film ignited into a global sensation, and The Immigrant with Broken English became the obsession of action cinema. Later, he would confess, "When Bloodsport came out, I cried because the little boy in Belgium was finally seen." The applause was thunderous, the lights blinding, and for the first time, he was no longer a ghost. Success did not glide in gently. It crashed down like a tidal wave. Kickboxer turned a modest budget into a $50 million triumph, etching forever the image of a drunken dance exploding into a split kick. A cascade of films followed. Lionheart, Death Warrant, each one proving he was no passing novelty. Double Impact doubled the myth. Van Damme against Van Damme, a dazzling storm of grace and grit. Then Universal Soldier brought him face-to-face with Dolph Lundgren, a brutal clash that thundered past $100 million and crowned him a global phenomenon. And then came Time Cop, The Summit. More than $100 million at the box office, critics silenced as Max Walker revealed a man who could not only break bones, but also break hearts. For a fleeting moment, the world glimpsed the fragile dreamer behind the fighter. Even video games bowed to his aura. Mortal Kombat's Johnny Cage was molded in his likeness, initials and swagger intact. Jean-Claude Van Damme was not just starring in Hollywood, he was reshaping it. Yet the cruel irony was already bleeding through the glamour. The dream that had once lifted him from hunger and humiliation was now chaining him in golden shackles. Later, Van Damme admitted with weary honesty, "I was working too much, flying from set to set, exhausted. I couldn't see my family." Stardom had saved him once, but now it was devouring him piece by piece. The relentless schedule left him bruised before the next camera even rolled. City after city, blurring into one endless set, applause echoing louder than his own heartbeat. Behind the million-dollar smile, his eyes darkened with shadows no makeup could hide. At home, the cheers of millions could not fill the silence of his own dinner table, where empty chairs spoke louder than applause. His marriages strained, his children felt the absence, and on set, whispers spread, late arrivals, nights blurred by champagne. The image of a man running from a fatigue deeper than the body could carry. The very salvation that had lifted him out of a freezing car seat now pressed on his shoulders like a merciless weight. Fame, once his greatest ally, had turned into a master with no mercy, no pause, no compassion. He had scaled the mountain he once prayed for as a trembling boy in a Belgian church. But every mountain casts a shadow, and in that shadow, darker battles awaited. Battles no choreography could script, no spotlight could soften, no applause could ever help him win. And they were coming for him next. Perhaps the most brutal battle lies in the heart. In 1980, at just 20 years old, he married Maria Rodriguez, a woman who offered him the stability and tenderness of a quiet life in Belgium. For a short while, Their marriage seemed to anchor him, reminding him that beyond trophies, training, and restless ambition, there could also be warmth and love. But Jean-Claude's gaze was fixed on a horizon far beyond Brussels. Hollywood's lights shimmered in his imagination with a promise too loud to ignore. And slowly, the vows he had spoken began to collide with the fire of his obsession. In 1982, when he chose to leave Europe with little more than a suitcase and a dream, Maria was left behind. Not out of malice, but because his path had no room for two. Their marriage, lasting only 4 years and never blessed with children, unraveled under the strain of distance, absence, and a dream that demanded everything. Maria would later describe life with him as unbearable, as if loving him meant standing in the middle of a storm she could not control. For Jean-Claude, the realization came later, heavy and unshakable. It was the first wound my dream left on someone I loved. His first step toward Hollywood had been paved with heartbreak. That marriage, young and fragile, became the first sacrifice at the altar of his ambition. It was a bitter lesson, written in silence and separation, that every prayer whispered in that Belgian church for stardom and glory would carry with it a hidden cost. Maria Rodriguez was not only his first wife, she was the first proof that success would never come without loss. But the lesson was not over. Fame kept rising, and so did the cost. And Cynthia Darion would become the next to bear its weight. After leaving behind his first marriage in Belgium and chasing the mirage of stardom across the ocean with only $3,000 in his pocket, odd jobs as a bouncer and a pizza delivery boy kept him afloat in Los Angeles. It was here, far from Brussels, that he met Cynthia Darion, a young woman from a wealthy American family who seemed to embody the stability and comfort he had abandoned when he left Europe. To many, their wedding in 1985 looked like the happy second chance of a man finally climbing toward his dream. The muscles from Brussels, once mocked as a puny four eyes, now marrying into privilege and love in the very city he longed to conquer. For a fleeting moment, it seemed he had found balance, the warmth of a home to counter the harsh lights of Hollywood. But the reality was far harsher. Hollywood's lights dazzled him. The promise of stardom roared louder than the quiet vows he had just spoken. Jean-Claude was consumed by a single obsession: to make it no matter the cost. That hunger, the same fire that once saved him, now became a merciless master at home. Cynthia would later sum up her pain in a single devastating confession. Living with Van Damme was hell because he only loved himself. Her words cut like a blade, exposing the truth he could not deny. His drive for glory was slowly strangling the love he had found. Their marriage, fragile and rushed, lasted just 1 year. There were no children to bind them, only the echo of what could have been. For Van Damme, this was more than a divorce. It was the first brutal sign that his dream was already demanding blood sacrifices. He had escaped poverty, escaped the sneers that once crushed his spirit. But in chasing the shimmering promise of Hollywood, he was losing something even more precious: the simple chance at a home, a family, and a love that could last. Cynthia was not just his second wife. She was the first omen, the first warning that the brighter his star burned, the more merciless the shadows would become. At the peak of his meteoric rise, when Hollywood lights burned brighter than ever, Jean-Claude Van Damme seemed untouchable. But life has a way of striking where armor is thinnest. In 1987, still soaring from the triumph of Bloodsport, He married Gladys Portugues, a former bodybuilder and fitness champion whose strength was matched only by her warmth. For the first time, he felt the fragile possibility of a home. Their son Christopher was born that same year, and in 1990, their daughter Bianca arrived on his own birthday, an almost poetic gift, as if fate was rewarding the boy who once prayed at 12 years old in a quiet Belgian church for family, for purpose, for a future under the lights. To the world, Van Damme was now both an action icon and a family man, living the dream. But behind the glossy magazine covers, cracks began to split the foundation. Hollywood demanded everything: his time, his body, his soul. The schedules left him broken and absent. And in those empty spaces, temptation crept in. And worse, his own choices carved wounds deeper than any opponent's strike. Rumors of infidelity surfaced, betrayals that cut far deeper than any roundhouse kick he had ever delivered. For Gladys, it was unbearable. The strong woman who had stood by his side, given him 2 children, and offered him the stability he once begged God for, suddenly found herself betrayed. After 5 years together, their marriage collapsed in 1992, and the woman who had been his anchor walked away, taking with her the laughter of their children that once filled their home. For Van Damme, it was a devastating blow, a heartbreak that reminded him of a truth he could not escape. No matter how many millions he earned, no matter how loudly the world cheered, the cost of his dream was the very love he had once prayed to protect. And as the cameras kept rolling, the fighter who had conquered the screen was losing the one battle that mattered most, the fight to keep his family whole. Years later, he would look back on that loss with a rare softness in his voice, admitting how much pain it caused to see his children grow up without him there. The man who could break bricks with a kick discovered the most shattering blow was not on screen. It was watching the family he had dreamed of slip through his fingers. It was a cruel twist of fate. The dream that had once saved him from loneliness had now stolen his chance at lasting love. And yet, this was only the beginning. Darker storms still loomed on the horizon. The echoes of his broken vows with Maria and the brief, searing collapse with Cynthia had barely faded when he sought solace once again. This time in the arms of Darcy LaPierre, a radiant former Miss Hawaii whose beauty and promise of stability seemed to offer him the peace he had been chasing since Belgium. In 1994, beneath the tropical skies of Bangkok, they married, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as if he had finally grasped the life he once prayed for as a trembling boy in a church pew: fame, family, and now the fragile hope of redemption. A year later, their son Nicholas was born, and his first cries should have been the purest answer to those prayers, the sound of a second chance, the living proof that perhaps all the sacrifices had not been in vain. But the storm inside Van Damme had not passed. It was only gathering force. Hollywood's temptation screamed louder with every premiere, every after-party, every hotel room where loneliness collided with fame. Soon, tabloids were ablaze with rumors. An alleged affair with pop star Kylie Minogue during the filming of Street Fighter, whispers of another entanglement with model Isabelle Fortea. The headlines did not just feed gossip. They mirrored the same betrayals that had already torn apart his bond with Gladys. For Darcy, proud and young, the hurt was unbearable. A woman who had given him a son suddenly left to question whether love was ever enough to compete with fame's hunger. The marriage, already trembling, fell apart in a blaze of cameras and bitter accusations. Darcy publicly accused Van Damme of being volatile, of a love that could not protect but only wound. By 1997, it was over, and their separation became one of the most public scandals of his life. Yet, the deepest wound was not the loss of another wife, not even the humiliation of headlines. It was Nicholas. When custody was stripped from him, Van Damme discovered a silence more merciless than any critic's review. The silence of a home where a child's laughter had been replaced by absence. Years later, his voice cracked when he confessed, "Not seeing my son, it broke me." For a man who had survived poverty, humiliation, addiction, and ridicule, this was the blow that truly shattered him. He could break bricks with a single kick, but he could not break the wall that now stood between him and his boy. What remained was the cruelest irony. While glass cases filled with trophies, his house grew emptier. While magazines called him a legend, his legacy at home was written in absence. Hollywood still celebrated the muscles from Brussels, but behind the camera stood a father haunted by what he had lost. A man who once believed glory would save him only to discover it had stolen the very love he prayed to protect. That absence gnawed at him night after night, a wound that no spotlight could disguise and no applause could drown. And as the lights of Hollywood burned ever brighter, the shadows inside him grew darker, driving him toward the abyss, toward addictions and scandals that would test not just the fighter on screen, but the fragile soul still trapped within. Losing Nicholas left a wound no trophy could cover. And into that emptiness crept shadows, darker than any opponent Jean-Claude Van Damme had ever faced. The man who once split the sky with his kicks now found himself fighting an enemy that lived inside his veins, his mind, his soul. By the early 90s, whispers of drugs had already followed him. But after the collapse of his fourth marriage, those whispers became screams. Some reports claimed he was consuming up to 10 grams a day, an amount that could kill a lesser man. His body, once sculpted like steel, now carried the slow rust of despair. Years later, stripped of bravado, he would admit softly, "I thought I was invincible. I was using too much. I was losing myself." On the set of Street Fighter in 1994, the lights blazed, costumes shimmered, and cameras demanded perfection. Yet behind the curtains, chaos brewed. Van Damme vanished for days at a time, pulled into the undertow of addiction. The film made money, but for those who watched him stagger, it was clear the man Hollywood had hailed as unstoppable was burning out frame by frame. The courts came next, turning private pain into public shame. A stunt accident left Jackson Pinckney blind in one eye. Nearly $500,000 was ordered in settlement, but the true cost was carved into Van Damme's conscience, a mistake no action scene could undo. Then in 1997, Frank Dux, the very martial artist whose story had made him famous, dragged him into court over a stolen script claim. Though Van Damme won, the headlines told another story. Betrayal, greed, a fallen hero. And still, the blows kept landing. That same year, in a crowded New York bar, biker and actor Chuck Zito flattened him in front of witnesses. For the man who felled giants on screen, the humiliation of being struck down in public became tabloid fodder worldwide. Each headline was another cut, bleeding away the myth of invincibility. Hollywood, once eager to crown him, began to recoil. At his peak, Van Damme demanded $20 million a picture, rivaling Jim Carrey. Studios balked, contracts slipped away, and the word blacklisted crept in like a death sentence. The tidal wave of stardom receded, leaving him stranded in silence. And in that silence, the abyss opened. Alone in a Hong Kong hotel room, Van Damme admitted he thought about ending it all. The boy who once prayed in a Belgian church for purpose and glory now stared into nothing, ready to surrender. No fight choreography could script this. No applause could drown out the sound of his own despair. By 1999, the spiral led him into flashing police lights. Arrested for driving under the influence, a mugshot replacing the glossy posters of his prime. For fans, it was unthinkable. For Van Damme, it was proof that the hero they adored was gone, leaving only a ghost stumbling through the ruins of his own legend. It was the cruelest irony. The very dream that had once lifted him from hunger, loneliness, and ridicule had stripped him of nearly everything else that made life worth living. Jean-Claude Van Damme, once hailed as the immortal muscles from Brussels, now stood as proof that even legends can break, haunted by shadows no spotlight could ever erase. And yet his fall carried a truth larger than himself. That glory without balance is a cage. That ambition without restraint can consume the very soul it was meant to save. For every cheer that once shook the theaters, there was now silence at home. For every trophy gleaming behind glass, there was an empty seat at the family table. It is a warning written not just in headlines, but in heartbreak. That success without peace is the most dangerous illusion of all. Still, as every true fighter knows, defeat is never final. What matters is not the fall, but the will to rise again. Redemption still flickered on the horizon, not as fame, not as fortune, but as the chance to reclaim the man behind the myth. If only he could survive the long night and reach for it. The fall had been brutal, but what made it unbearable was the truth no headline could capture. Jean-Claude Van Damme was not just fighting the world outside, but a storm inside his own mind. In the late 1990s, doctors finally put a name to the chaos: bipolar disorder. For years, he had been swinging between extremes. Manic bursts where he could train 20 hours straight without sleep. Convinced he was unstoppable, followed by lows so crushing that getting out of bed felt like lifting a mountain. Addiction had only poured fuel on that fire, dragging him deeper into cycles of euphoria and despair. Beneath the spotlight, it was not fame, but an illness quietly scripting his life. The diagnosis was a double-edged blade, devastating in what it revealed, liberating in what it explained. It gave reason to the turbulence that had cost him marriages, friends, and nearly his career. But it also gave him a chance to fight back. The battle of recovery began with medication to calm the chemical storms in his brain, paired with therapy that forced him to confront the shadows he had long avoided. And then came the return to discipline. The same ballet, karate, and bodybuilding that had once transformed a fragile boy into a fighter. Now they were not about preparing for the next movie. They were survival itself. Every stretch, every kick, every drop of sweat became a prayer, a plea to reclaim the man he was losing. This was no heroic montage. It was nights of shaking, days of doubt, weeks where giving up felt easier than enduring. He stumbled. He relapsed. He bled in silence. But each time he forced himself back up, slowly, painfully, he broke free. By the early 2000s, Van Damme had left drugs behind, and with steady treatment, his bipolar disorder came under control, not cured, but managed, allowing him to live, work, and love again. Without discipline, he later confessed, I would not have survived. The man once celebrated for breaking bricks with his legs was now learning to rebuild himself piece by fragile piece. And in that fight, something unexpected happened. By speaking of his illness openly, by admitting he was not invincible, Van Damme broke another wall. This time, not in a dojo or on a movie set, but in the stigma surrounding mental health. For fans who once saw him as untouchable, his honesty became a lifeline. It told them that strength is not the absence of weakness, but the courage to face it head-on. Jean-Claude Van Damme had faced the abyss and walked back. His body bore scars. His mind carried shadows, but his spirit proved unbroken. The hardest battles he had shown are not fought in tournaments or on screens. They are fought in silence within the self. And in surviving them, he discovered a victory greater than any box office crown. The proof that redemption is real, recovery is possible, and that even legends are human. From the ruins of scandal and despair, when Hollywood had all but carved his gravestone, Jean-Claude Van Damme began to rise again, not with a kick, but with a confession. In 2008, in JCVD, he stepped out of the myth and into raw humanity, breaking the fourth wall in a 6-minute monologue that ended with him weeping openly. For the first time, audiences were not watching the muscles from Brussels, the indestructible fighter, the action star. They were watching a broken man begging to be understood. It was not choreography. It was truth. Time magazine called it Oscar-worthy. Millions called it unforgettable. That moment was not just a performance. It was a resurrection. The first flicker of light after years of darkness. What followed were not mere films, but fragments of a soul returning. Universal Soldier, Regeneration, 2009, and Day of Reckoning, 2012, rekindled the flame of his legacy, proving the warrior still lived within him. In The Expendables 2, in 2012, he strode onto the screen as a villain so magnetic that critics whispered, Van Damme never left. Statues began to rise in Brussels, Azerbaijan, Munich, not to celebrate the scandals, but to honor the symbol, the man who turned a split kick into immortality. In 2013, the Volvo truck commercial swept the world viral. There he was, balanced between two moving giants, legs stretched in a perfect split, body poetry in motion, spirit defying time itself. Even in 2016-2017, with Jean-Claude Van Johnson, he laughed at himself, transforming his own legend into satire and winning applause not for his strength, but for his humility. This was not a comeback. This was reinvention. Yet the truest act of resurrection did not unfold under studio lights, but within the fragile chamber of his own heart. In 1999, battered and lost, he returned to the woman he had betrayed, but never ceased to love, Gladys Portugues. She had given him 2 children, Christopher and Bianca. And more than that, she had given him the one thing Hollywood could never script, a home. Their reunion was no fairy tale. It was a battle of forgiveness, a daily choice to heal what fame had shattered. Even in 2015, when divorce papers once more threatened to close the chapter, they chose love over pride, reconciliation over ruin. Today, she remains not as a shadow of his fame, but as the lighthouse that pulled him back from the abyss, the love that saved him from himself, This, above all, was the resurrection that mattered. Not box office numbers, not statues of bronze, but the rediscovery of family, forgiveness, and the quiet, defiant power of love. After storms and scandals, after broken vows and shattered headlines, Jean-Claude Van Damme still stands not as a flawless hero, but as a man who refused to surrender. And in that refusal, his story became larger than cinema, larger than fame. It became a testament carved in fire and ash that even when the world counts you out, when your name is written off and your spirit lies in ruins, redemption is still possible. Now at 63 years old, Jean-Claude Van Damme lives not in the blinding glare of constant premieres, but in a quieter light that carries dignity, discipline, and the weight of everything he has endured. His net worth today is estimated at around $40 million, an empire built from decades of blockbusters, global tours, and endorsements that kept his legend alive even during the years Hollywood closed its doors. Much of that fortune rests in what he once lacked most: stability. In Los Angeles, he owns a Mediterranean-style villa worth several $million, with terracotta roofs, sunlit courtyards, and a private gym where his mornings still begin with stretches, splits, and weight training. In Brussels, the city of his birth, he maintains a residence that ties him to his roots, a quiet space filled with family photographs, a reminder of the boy with glasses who once prayed for stardom in a Belgian church. And in Hong Kong, the city that first embraced him as an international star, he built a hillside retreat overlooking the harbor, a place where he once escaped the storm of fame and now returns to for peace. These are not just properties. They are monuments to survival. Every marble floor, every iron gate, every carefully tended garden stands as a quiet triumph over the nights he once spent curled in the back seat of a broken car, stealing food just to live another day. Today, when he walks through the halls of his homes, it is not arrogance that follows him, but gratitude. He has built a life where his family will never know the hunger, the cold, or the loneliness that once threatened to break him. And that, more than any trophy or paycheck, may be his greatest victory. Yet wealth is not the whole story. His health, once nearly broken by addiction and untreated illness, is now something he guards with monk-like discipline. Diagnosed with bipolar disorder in the late 1990s, he has spent decades learning to manage it through medication, therapy, and above all, the physical discipline that has always been his salvation. Even now, he trains every day, stretching until his body lengthens like a bowstring, holding his legendary splits with quiet precision, balancing on bars, lifting iron, moving with a grace that defies his years. The training is no longer for cameras, but for survival, for peace of mind. His diet is strict: lean proteins, vegetables, hydration, no alcohol. He often speaks of meditation, of martial arts as medicine for the spirit, proof that a warrior's fight never ends. It only changes form. But age writes its own script. Van Damme admits that the hardest part of growing older is not the dimming of fame, but the silence of loss. The years he missed with his son Nicholas, the echoes of regret when he looks at his children as grown adults. His body, though still formidable, carries the stiffness of decades of combat, joints that ache, muscles that no longer heal overnight. The once flawless face, once carved like marble under studio lights, now bears lines etched by time. But those lines carry a beauty of their own. They are not flaws. They are the signature of survival. Proof of a man who has lived, stumbled, fallen, risen, and endured. In those eyes, still sharp beneath the weathered skin, lies a fire that age cannot extinguish. A reminder that legends may wrinkle, but they never fade. At home, his anchor is still Gladys Portuguese, the woman he once betrayed, lost, and found his way back to. Together they have endured storms few marriages could survive. And through them, they raised Christopher and Bianca, children who now carry echoes of their father's charisma and strength in their own ways. In 2015, when divorce papers once again threatened to end their journey, they chose forgiveness over finality. Today, Gladys is not simply his wife. She is the living proof that even the most shattered paths can circle back to love, and that redemption is never just a word, but a choice made daily. There is no public record of a will. But at 63, Van Damme has spoken about legacy not in terms of wealth or property, though his fortune and home stand as symbols of what he fought for, but in lessons carved out of suffering, discipline, perseverance, humility. He has said he wants his children to inherit not just millions, but the knowledge that even the strongest warriors must bow to balance. His days now are measured less by premieres and more by rhythm, disciplined training sessions, quiet meals at home, long walks with his dogs. The kind of stillness he once thought impossible. He still appears before the world, whether on film sets, talk shows, or viral ads. Not to prove he is immortal, but to remind us he is still here, still fighting, still standing. For fans, Jean-Claude Van Damme is no longer just the muscles from Brussels. He has become something greater, a testament that no matter how high you rise, no matter how far you fall, there is always a way to rise again. His wealth may measure in millions, but his true riches are written in resilience, in forgiveness, in the family that chose to stay, and in the fact that after storms that would have destroyed anyone else, he is still standing. And so we honor him not as a flawless man, but as a survivor, a warrior, a legend who proved that the greatest battles are not won on screen, but in the silence of the human heart. If his films once lit a fire in your youth, if his resilience still inspires you today, tell us below. Share your memory. Share your respect. Because Jean-Claude Van Damme is not just a relic of Hollywood's golden past. He is living proof that redemption, fragile but real, is always within reach.